Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. It's sunny here in Chicago. We're gonna let everybody get in, give them a few minutes before we start. Thanks for being with us today. Nice to see some faces. Thanks for those who have your cameras on. It's affirming for us to see faces rather than just blank screens, so we appreciate it. So again, happy Tuesday. I'm Gail Luxenberg, and in a few minutes I'll be joined by my guest, Margaret Chen. But I want to say a few words before we get started today. First of all, this conversation is sponsored by the Chicago Booth Alumni Club. And if you haven't followed them, you can find them on Facebook or LinkedIn. Lots of events going on, live and remote. So that's one group. The other group that is sponsoring us today is Bank. Bank is the Booth Alumni Nonprofit Consultants. If you're in Chicago and you're interested in helping nonprofits do more good, Booth is a fantastic program to join. You can find out more about it again on the Booth Alumni page. And volunteering it's a great way to volunteer and do work for a nonprofit. The other group that's sponsoring us today is the Rustandy Center at the University of Chicago. And I've been asked to mention that April 29th, they'll be putting on a seminar called Onboard. So look for that and sign on to the Rustandy Center on the Booth Alumni page. And I see that some of my colleagues are posting in the chat so you can get more information on all of these. So I wanted to mention this is conversation today is one in a series that we've done during these alternative times, or maybe the new times. And you can, all of them have been recorded. So you could go to Booth's YouTube page. You could go to my YouTube page. You'll find conversations about finding meaning in your career, which we did about a year ago with Eric Wertheimer. We did preparing for your board journey, building resilient teams. Diversity and inclusion was another one we did. Many of these with Booth alum. And we did one on big data and tax assessment with our Cook County Assessor, Fritz Kage, and also one on banks. So those are all archived, my LinkedIn page, YouTube, Booth's LinkedIn page. So through this process of doing these conversations, I met Margaret Chen, and we started talking about doing this conversation together today. So just a few words. I come at this through a nonprofit lens. I've spent my career leading nonprofits in Chicago, Atlanta, and Seattle, and now I do recruitment to help organizations find their next nonprofit leader, both in the nonprofit and association field. And through all this work, I came in touch with Margaret. So let me tell you a little bit about Margaret and ask her to join me in this conversation. Margaret Chen is a certified executive coach. She's experienced in career transitions, leadership development, and board candidacy. She works with clients as they prepare for board candidacy process. She has 25 years experience in the executive search field, 18 years at Spencer Stewart and at Korn Ferry. She has assessed over 3,500 executives on their leadership and communication styles. She advises boards of directors on recruiting CEOs and new board members. And she has experience in all fields. She's worked with financial services, private equity, hedge funds, insurance, consumer goods, luxury goods, retail, media, technology, consulting, and more. She's a coach for Columbia Business School's Leadership Lab and its executive program. She's worked with our colleagues at Wharton, Stanford, Columbia, Cornell, and us. And she holds an MBA from Kellogg and an undergraduate degree from New York University and comes to us today from Manhattan. So welcome, Margaret.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, nice to see you. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to take questions along the way, and it's going to be a conversation. You could either put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I'll be able to see you. And we also have questions that have been submitted online. But first, Margaret, I want to ask you a defining question. So tell us, how do you define the terms? What kind of board service are we talking about? What does it mean to serve on a board? I've heard us talk about nonprofit, for-profit. Can you define all of that for us?
Sure. Let's start first with nonprofit boards. As a board member, you are never paid, but you are expected to make a financial commitment as well as be able to access a network of potential donors. If you can join a not-for-profit board that has a recognizable name, that's terrific. You will learn how a board operates as well as understand what contributions you can make. Anything else you'd like to add, Gail, about?
Nope.
Okay. And then there are advisory boards. Advisory boards advise the overall organization's board. Advisory boards do not have fiduciary responsibilities nor liabilities. So you could get good board experience with less risk. And the advisory boards are usually composed of what I call subject matter experts, meaning they have specific expertise in specific areas that a company is less able to perhaps hire consultants or experts. So generally, advisory boards are found in smaller companies or VC, angel investing, or PE-backed firms. And usually these positions are filled through networking. So now let's talk about private boards. This can include family-owned companies, PE, and VC-backed firms. There is much less scrutiny of private boards than public. Although the current diversity legislation only applies to public company boards, they are not required by private company boards, because private company boards usually don't have the institutional investors who are the ones who've been pushing for a lot of diversity. Now, private company boards do feel some pressure to improve their governance. So it's a good opportunity to get board experience at this time and consider private boards. Okay, now let's talk about the big gorilla, which is public company boards. You are paid, and historically it's required prior public board experience, but that's changing with diversity initiatives. Public boards have the highest risk, but the highest reward. It has the greatest scrutiny, and new positions are generally filled through current board members and their contacts. But again, that's changing because public companies are under such pressure to diversify. So large public companies often use search firms to conduct their searches for board members because it broadens the candidate pool that they can talk to. And it also demonstrates a public commitment that they are interested in diversity. Public company boards are the hardest to get onto for your very first public board opportunity. And usually to get on your first public board, I would generally recommend a lot of networking as well as talking to search firms.
Great. Margaret, thanks for that. So really what we wanted to focus on today is getting ready to become that board member. So how do you do that? How do you assess if you're ready for a public board?
Okay. When I was in executive search and I was interviewing candidates for board searches, I had to assess whether they have the right skill set and the right mindset. And the skill set and mindset are both different from those of an operating executive. So for example, what kind of skill set are we talking about? For an operating executive, they have a wide range of skill sets to get things done. For example, they can lead, direct, influence, build consensus, as well as they can incentivize with promotions, more responsibility, visibility, and of course, comp. But a board director is not a direct management role. So to get things done, they have a much narrower skill set they can use. For example, their role is to work with boards, the rest of the board, to make decisions by influencing, persuading, building consensus, and gaining alignment. So it's a more narrow skill set, but it also means they need to have a deeper development of these skill sets, such as influencing and consensus building, more than an operating executive. And if you think about it, a board director, their role is to constantly assess the CEO. What is the CEO doing? What results are they achieving? How are they achieving the results? And ultimately, whether the CEO's approach how much will it increase risk to the organization? Because ultimately, a board member's role, one of the board members' main objectives is to anticipate and reduce risk to an organization. Now that's the skill set. Now let's think about mindset. An operating executive is focused on driving operating executives every day because they're measured by their metric. They're measured with metrics. Whereas a board director has fiduciary responsibilities. They're focusing on the broader strategy of the organization. They're focusing on corporate governance, anticipating risk, and assessing enterprise impact. And they're accountable to more external stakeholders, such as, of course, shareholders, but large institutional investors, pension funds, activist shareholders, regulators. And for the nonprofit world, they're accountable to donors and grantors. Also, an operating executive knows their industry well, where they work. So they become almost like a subject matter expert in their industry. But if you're currently an operating executive and you want to join another board, you cannot join a board in the same industry where you work, because that's a conflict of interest. So you have to join a board of an industry you're not currently in. So that means you have to shift from being a subject matter expert to learning a new industry and being able to add value quickly. So the question is always, for me, in assessing the candidate is, are they ready to make that shift in their mindset? And the other thing that's really important to think about is, as a board member, are you ready to take on more risk? Because when a CEO makes a bad decision or a strategy fails, the board is accountable. Because the assumption is the board approved it. If there's fraud, usually the board doesn't hear about it way before, right when it's discovered, not much in advance. And the board will be held accountable because they were supposed to have ensured that strong controls were in place to prevent the fraud. What about financial risk? Public companies have directors and officers insurance, liability insurance for board members. Is there enough coverage for you? You want to assess that. What about smaller companies? Some of them do not provide directors and officers, meaning D&O insurance, to their board members. You'll have to pay for that. Or smaller companies may have bought less expensive policies, which may not have the same level of coverage. So you need to assess if you're comfortable with that. And then what about reputational risk? If a company runs into trouble, you are on the board at the time. It could be a hit to your reputation. So I think in assessing whether you are ready to join a public board, it's really important to assess what your risk level is and making sure you have the right mindset and the right skill set.
I love that, Margaret. And, I've stepped down from being a CEO of an organization, and my mantra in my life right now is I'm not in charge anymore. And it takes a while for that to sink in. And I think that's really important in the mindset. The best board members are the ones who know how to be part of the team, and they don't have to necessarily demonstrate their executive skills all the time, but they have to demonstrate their know-how. The other thing I wanted to say is directors insurance. Do you know insurance? Directors and officers, nonprofit boards, if you're looking to serve, ask that question. It's the same as public boards. If your nonprofit is not carrying that insurance, they really need to for their executive director and their board members as well. So that's really an important one. So what's the career path, Margaret? How do you position yourself?
Well, historically, P&L experience was the only criteria practically for someone to be qualified to serve on a board. But that's not exclusively so anymore. Mm-hmm. That in a moment. For not-for-profit, experience with budgets, fundraising, access to donors, those are very important. What else? Would you like, anything else you'd like to add, Gail? For not-for-profit?
Yeah, I think, I ran a Habitat for Humanity. We were looking for people who had access to land and knew how to do development. We were looking for legal skills that we didn't have internally, that somebody could advise us in, not that they would be doing the work, but that they would be giving us advice in it. So wherever we had gaps, HR skills were really important, because a lot of nonprofits are not, they're not staffed as highly as a for-profit would be. And so they're looking for professional expertise. So any one of those areas was hugely helpful.
Right. Well, as I was saying earlier, historically, P&L experience was the only criteria, which made it difficult for companies to identify, quote, qualified women. And so, because more men reach more senior levels in companies than women, which means that they have more access to P&L responsibility more quickly. So that's why boards were composed of mostly men. But that's changing as we're speaking because of the focus on diversity. So what are other relevant experiences that companies are more open to now? If you've had experience working for multiple public companies, that would be very helpful, because then you've learned how companies interacted with different types of shareholders, as well as perhaps you've gotten exposure to perhaps more institutional investors, or maybe your company had dealt with activist shareholders. So you understand their expectations, and you've been exposed to the functions that are important to a public company, such as capital markets, fundraising, investor relations. I mean, I'm not recommending job hopping, but I think working for multiple industries does demonstrate your learning agility. The fact that you're able to learn a new industry and be successful. So what are other functions? Boards have always been open to anyone with finance experience. And the finance committee is one of the most, or the audit committee is considered one of the most important committees of a company. Right now, a lot of companies, it's not well publicized. A lot of companies are facing issues related to cybersecurity because of ransomware. Last May, Colonial Pipeline paid $5 million in ransomware, and they publicized the fact that they made that payment. And most companies prefer not to make public when they paid ransomware. So I think for every company that announces, there are probably 10 who were paid and didn't announce. But it's an active, proactive, it's an active issue for boards to deal with. Social media, global expansions, market expansions, distribution supply chain issues, all those would be highly relevant experience. The other thing to think about is, what experiences have you had with companies different stages of their life cycle? For example, have you experienced with growth companies or companies going through transformations, or companies in a very acquisitive stage where they were just buying a lot of companies, or turnarounds. The best, if you could match your experience to a company's current life stage, then you have addressed a lot of their issues and could make you an interesting candidate.
So Margaret, there's questions in the chat. I'm looking at them. I'm going to try to put them under umbrellas and others that we got before we started. I think the board service has a ladder of commitment that once you start with one, you can look for the next and look for the next. So the big question that I think, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, public boards, is how do you get started? How do you land that first one?
Okay. The first thing you have to do is be very clear about what your value proposition is to a board, particularly and especially if you have no board experience. So when I coach clients who are interested in joining boards for the first time, I want them to identify and clarify very clearly what their value proposition is. And then what we do is make sure that experience is highlighted in their board bio, which is different from an executive bio. And that value proposition is needed for their networking, okay? So, for example, when a company is looking for a new board member, they have a very targeted profile. It isn't just, oh, which best friend is available. They have a specific need where they're looking to fill what I call experience gaps, what they currently don't have on their board. And it could be related to companies' potential current strategy or strategies they're considering, or it could be challenges the company's facing. So for example, what kind of strategic things could they be facing? They may have a new growth strategy. They may be considering a new business model. They may be expanding to new geographies. They may be considering different distribution channels, more media presence, or maybe a financial transformation, any of those. And if they don't have that experience on the board, that's going to be their target profile. Now, they could also be trying to address specific challenges, like bad execution that didn't go well, okay? So in that case, candidates who've had success with complex global expansions, that would be the kind of candidate they'd be looking for. What about companies facing financial restatements or financial integrity? The people with the audit experience would be in demand. So the point is you want to figure out what the company's strategies or challenges they're facing and how does it match up with your experience? And that's part of your value proposition. And then the other thing we talked about earlier was making sure that you can match up your experience with the company's current life stage. And then you also want to look at committees, okay, that the company has and where you can add value. All companies have an audit committee, a comp committee, as well as a nominating/governance committee. But some companies have other operating and standing committees, like an executive committee, particularly for large companies where they have to make decisions between formal board meetings. They'll have a risk and compliance meeting. They'll have a board development meeting. They'll have a marketing committee. So all these committees, you think, are they relevant to your experience? Could you add value? So the point is you want to be very clear about your value proposition. Do you want me to talk about networking?
I think the networking component is the same for nonprofit and for-profit. So yeah, if you would talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about how nonprofit is a little bit different.
Terrific. Okay. So you want to be strategic about your value proposition, but you also want to be strategic about your networking. And networking, the goal is to identify the people who have access to information about board openings. And you let them know about your value proposition and your interest in joining boards. And there are two avenues, major avenues, okay? One is through networking, meaning contacts, okay. Referrals to boards for new board positions often come from current board directors in their contacts. And that's always been a big criticism of why boards are not diverse, because they're just hiring a lot of their friends and friends of friends.
Right.
Okay. So with startups, it's a very closely connected community, particularly with angel investing and VC communities. Boards, usually boards for those kinds of organizations are filled through connections. So you want to get your name known in that universe. What about, do you know people who are currently on boards? Talk to them about what they think are the experience gaps on their board. Ask them what they anticipate could be their next need in terms of experience. And then you want to identify a list of companies you're interested, whose boards you're interested in. Network your way into getting an introduction to a board member and to their board development committee. The other thing is boards generally have terms of 3 to 4 years, and after that they're up for re-election. Many companies allow board members to serve multiple terms, but they may have a cap on you can't serve more than 3 terms or 4 terms. And also, so they may have what we call term limits. So you can look up when the term limits will end for a current board member, and you can be assured that the board is starting to look for their replacement 6 months in advance. The other thing is aging out of boards. With executive searches for operating executives, they're legally not allowed to ask for your age. But with board searches, they can and they will, because a lot of companies have age limits, meaning you cannot serve after you hit age, and it's usually the early 70s for public boards. So you know that certain board members will age out in the next year or two. So that would be a good time to be doing all your networking and telling people you're interested. And all this information about term limits and age and when board members will step down. For public companies, it's all it's all public information. It's in the proxy statements. So you can know when an opening is coming up before it's announced. And you can be sure that the board will have started a search at least 6 months in advance. So this is what I mean about strategic, about how you network. Let me just share 2 tips to save you some time, okay? I know some of you have never served on a board before, but others may have already served on boards. If you're currently a CEO or a direct report to a CEO, before you do spend a lot of time trying to get onto a board, you should check with your current employer and see if they'll allow you to serve on a board. Many companies don't allow senior executives to serve on outside boards. And if they do, they limit the number of outside boards you can serve on because of the time needed. The other tip is, if you're already on a board, you should look at the schedule of board meetings of companies you're interested in, because if it's a conflict with your current board, that's a major deal stopper. Unless you're going to plan to step down from your current board, which may be a hit to your reputation, to take on a new board. One of the first things search firms do in looking at potential candidates, they look at what board you're currently serving on, and does it conflict, and do those board meetings conflict with the board meetings of the search they're working on? In which case the answer is no. But search firms are well trained to research way in advance when your current board term will end. And 6 months before that, they'll be saying, hey, I have a board that has the same board dates as your current organization. Are you planning to be up for re-election? Or are you stepping down? Now, let's talk more about search firms. We talked about the fact that some companies will use search firms because it gives them greater exposure to a broader range of candidates, and it reinforces their commitment. And search firms give the companies greater visibility. Now, of the 4 largest search firms, and you can Google those, they all have significant board practices. And one of those top 4 firms is Spencer Stewart, where I worked for 12 years. And Korn Ferry is another one of the big 4, and I worked there for 6. And at Spencer Stewart, I did board searches. Spencer Stewart has the largest market share of board searches in the United States. Now, there are also medium and boutique firms and specialist firms that do board searches. So it's not restricted to just the top 4 firms, but I'm just saying the top 4 firms command have most of the market share. So you want to network into search firms so they know that you're interested in boards. Do you have relationships with search firms? Have you ever been recruited by a search firm? In which case, you have a relationship with the search firm. Have you ever used a search firm, hired a search firm to build your leadership team? You've been a client of a search firm, okay? You can talk to them about your interest in joining boards. Even if you hired a search firm to do a search for you, they cannot, if a search firm placed you in an executive role, they cannot recruit you out, but they can talk to you about boards.
Yeah.
That's not a conflict. So what you want to do is go talk to your search firm contacts and tell them about your interest. Okay. So it's really important to be strategic. Okay. But let's say you don't have any search firm relationships. Okay. You could talk to people who are your peers, who perhaps have been recruited by search firms or have hired a search firm to recruit for them, or you could talk with people who are senior to you, who definitely would have search firm relationships, and ask for an introduction. Gail, anything else to add here?
All that you've just talked about, Margaret, and we're getting some comments again in the chat. A lot of it is different for the nonprofit field. 2 opportunities from Nandita and Steve just showed up on our chat if you're interested in nonprofit service. Because it's not compensated and because it's mission driven, the process tends to be very different. And with nonprofits, it really takes having a passion for the mission and raising your hand and letting them know that you're interested. And it's not just letting them know, but it means letting the senior executive director know that you're interested. Some of the best board members that we worked on developing came from our volunteers. And there's, at Habitat, I shared with Margaret an example of one of our guys who was a regular on our building sites, happened to own the largest building company in the Northwest, and he did roads and runways for airports and bridges around the country. And he was a Saturday volunteer. He mentioned to one of our volunteers, geez, how do I get on your board? Luckily, that message got to me. And that he eventually became our board president and gave a large gift to go along with it. So it really means raising your hand and letting people know, but being a volunteer first is a great way to find out if you're interested in that, in the mission. There's not a lot of search firms that recruit for a nonprofit. So that is not a path you want to go because they're not compensated jobs. So I know on our chat, there are opportunities opening up and you can start researching on GuideStar or Charity Navigator if you're not involved with a charity today, those that match up with your interest, and start volunteering and learning about them. And that's a path. There's one question that's come up and was submitted to us earlier. Margaret, is nonprofit board service a ladder towards public board service or private board service? Is there any experience that is valued from one to the other? Because certainly the nonprofit boards might be easier to get into, but do they offer any advantage for for-profit board service or public board service?
I say that if you can get onto a board of a nonprofit that has a recognizable name, then you will at least have experience of how a board operates. Okay. But not all nonprofit experience is transferable to another for-profit board. So for some clients, I would say an advisory board would be the next easier to get onto. Okay. And there's no fiduciary liability involved. And so and also you will get exposed to the overall board because you're advising the overall organizational board.
Okay.
The next step is private boards, and then it's public. So yes, there is like a ladder, if you want to call it. Mm-hmm. But can somebody get onto a public board without any experience of any board experience? It's unlikely.
There you go.
So it's good to get some experience. You know, Gail, you triggered another thought that I meant to add, which is that when I was talking earlier about networking and search firms, one thing to keep in mind is that search firms, even if they don't know you, they're constantly calling people they know as sources for potential searches. They'll say, I'm doing this kind of board search. Can you think of someone who might be right? We're looking for this profile. Can you recommend someone? So you want all your contacts who potentially could be called by search firms to think of you, to be top of mind for them to recommend you. So that's why it is really effective if you expand the number of people who know you're looking for boards.
Great. And I noticed that Fred put in the chat that larger nonprofits do indeed have committee structures that are similar and is a good starting place. Finance committee, HR committee, talent committee, that type of thing. So Craig asked, and Craig Selders, about the time commitment that board service that you can expect in board service. Can you address that, Margaret?
Sure. First of all, in general, time commitment with boards has been increasing in recent years. Public boards are the most demanding, require the most time. And when you add up all the hours, it comes to about 4 to 6 weeks a year, which is a lot, which is why a lot of companies won't allow their CEOs to serve on more than one external board. Because that's a month to a month and a half of the year that they're not devoting to their business. Now, Spencer Stewart publishes board surveys on public, and they did a recent one on public companies in 2020 for 2021. The average number of board meetings is 9.4 meetings a year. And half the companies do 6 to 9 meetings, and private boards do a little or about the same. But those are just the formal board meetings. And often when you're attending the board meeting, it's multi-day events because they want to build relationships among the board members. So it could be a 3-day commitment. Also, there are other meetings you have to attend. All the committee meetings. So the audit committee for public companies meet 8.4 meetings a year. Comp committee, 6.2 meetings a year. And the nominating and governance committee, 4.7. And also you have to attend managing presentations and strategy sessions. And then many hours of prep and travel time. Now, of course, right now in COVID, it's no travel time, but when things open up. And when an organization is having a crisis, the time commitment could double. So it's a big time commitment. So you want to make sure you can really parse out the time.
I want to answer Vikram's question about the financial commitments on nonprofit boards. So first I want to make a distinction between professional and membership boards, which are not paid for the most part, and do not require a financial commitment. But if it's a 501c3, a nonprofit organization, you want to understand their mission, and usually a financial commitment is required, and you want to be clear about that before you join the board and find out what that is. Many nonprofits, many well-run nonprofits will ask you to sign something in advance, asking for an annual gift of X amount. The more high-powered the board, the larger or more visible the organization, the larger the gift might be, especially in the field of the arts. You might wind up on their advisory board as a way to start and see if it's for you. But yes, the answer is, for the most part, it is yes, there is a financial commitment, sometimes stated, sometimes unstated, sometimes give, sometimes get. If you're not prepared to write a check yourself, are you able to raise funds that you could bring to the organization? So it's a give or get, and the answer is yes. Great. Another question, are advisory boards paid? In the nonprofit world, again, no, but I'm throwing it back to you, Margaret.
It depends on the organization. It's not always. So you have to investigate.
Okay. Is an NACD certificate valuable?
Well, let me put it this way. I never conducted a search where that was required, a board search where that was a requirement. Okay, but in terms of knowledge for the candidate, you know, that's up to, I think that it's up to them. But it's never been a requirement for any board searches I've done.
Russell asks, I'm serving on private company boards. How do I transition onto a public board?
The same way that we just talked about. You know, same networking strategy, and now your value proposition, you have to be clear about your value proposition. So if you're on the advisory board, were you a subject matter expert on a specific topic? And if so, you could leverage that to a public company that's facing that kind of challenge. So that would be the value add. No, I don't have experience with a public board, but I know what I have experience with a topic where you need experience.
And in the closing minutes that we have together, is there anybody who would like, if I haven't gotten you in the chat, anybody want to raise a hand and see and have a question for Margaret or myself?
If not, I'd like to spend a couple minutes on board bios.
Go ahead.
Okay, board bios are different from executive bios. For many of you, if you've ever been a public speaker, I'm sure I'm sorry, if you've been a speaker, industry speaker, I'm sure you have an executive bio. But a board bio is different because an executive bio usually focuses on leading and driving business results. A board bio focuses on strategy, enterprise-wide impact, enterprise risk management, oversight, and long-term issues. So as we discussed earlier about how board, for boards, you have a different skill set and different mindset. You want to communicate that in your board bio. For example, talk about overseeing, facilitating, influencing, persuading, gaining alignment, building consensus, gaining approval of things you worked on, particularly with multiple stakeholders with multiple agendas. And if you, and also when you're targeting boards of different industries, you want to focus on your learning, you want your board bio to focus on your learning agility. And that could mean success with new business models, new ways of doing business. There was one other thought I had. Oh, one last thing. The most attractive situation would be if you worked is to pursue a board of an industry you previously worked for. Because you have industry experience from your prior industry, but you don't have a conflict because you're not in that industry today. Then you have a combination of knowledge with no conflict.
Great. Great. Margaret, that was a good start to a conversation. I hope there's many more. There are great resources in the chat from the Chicago Booth Alumni Club, from Bank, Booth Alumni Nonprofit Consultants, and also from the Rustandy Center, and look for their onboarding conferences. So those are all in the chat. You can follow up with either myself or Margaret. You can link into either of us. And Margaret is at chanexecutivecoach.com. You can reach her there. That is it. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. I hope this whetted your appetite.
Nice
Bye,
speaking.
Margaret.
Afternoon. Thank you.